In January of 1901, a merchant vessel was found adrift off the fog-choked coast of Oregon. Her name was the Cormorant. She had sailed from San Francisco with a full crew of 12 men, a captain known for his discipline and cargo worth thousands. But when she was discovered, the deck was silent. No blood, no struggle, just a single lantern still burning, its flame untouched by wind. The logbook ended mid-sentence. The tea on the captain's desk was still warm. The men of the Cormorant had simply vanished, leaving behind a ship that refused to die quietly. The fog rolled in thick and heavy that morning, so dense that the horizon vanished into a wall of silver. The sea lay unnaturally still, its surface glass-like and cold as if it were holding its breath. It was January 4th, 1901, when a small coastal cutter from Tillamook first spotted her, an old merchant bark drifting soundlessly about 3 miles offshore. No distress flags, no signal flares, just a faint glimmer of a lantern swaying at the bow. When they drew closer, the name came into view through the haze. The Cormorant. The crew of the cutter expected carnage, wreckage from a storm, maybe an attack by pirates or smugglers. But the deck of the Cormorant was as still as a tomb. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and oil. The sails hung limp, weathered, but intact. The hull bore no signs of battle or storm, and yet not a single soul was aboard. The men who boarded her would later speak of the silence, how it pressed against their ears, how their voices seemed swallowed before leaving their throats. The first mate found a kettle of tea still sitting on the galley stove, long gone cold but recently brewed. A deck of cards lay on a table, half a hand dealt. In the captain's quarters, a candle had melted into a pool of wax beside a journal, the final page of which ended abruptly with a line that made even seasoned sailors uneasy. Voices below again. We'll investigate before dawn. There were 12 men on the crew manifest, led by Captain Elias Ward, a man whose reputation for strict discipline and uncanny seamanship made him both respected and feared. Ward believed the sea was alive, that it remembered, and that men who disrespected it paid in kind. Superstitious, yes, but never reckless. For him to vanish without a trace defied reason. The ship's last departure had been ordinary. Records showed the Cormorant left San Francisco on December 12th, bound for Astoria, Oregon, with a cargo of mining tools, canned goods, and spirits. She should have reached port within a week. Instead, she wandered into legend. No storms were recorded during that window. No distress calls. The sea calm and clear. When word spread, the coastal towns turned restless. Fishermen muttered that the Cormorant had crossed into the Veil, a local superstition that claimed certain stretches of fog along the Oregon coast weren't fog at all, but gateways to the aftersea, where drowned sailors waited for the living. The more practical townsfolk suspected mutiny or disease, yet there was no blood, no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no lifeboats. Everything aboard seemed preserved, almost staged, as though the crew had simply walked off mid-sentence. One of the rescuers, Jonas Mercer, later confessed to a strange feeling while exploring below deck. He claimed he heard faint tapping sounds coming from the hull, as if someone were knocking from the other side. The ship's carpenter dismissed it as water settling in the timbers. But Mercer swore it was rhythmic, deliberate. He left the ship shaken, refusing ever to board another vessel. The local authorities took possession of the Cormorant, towing her into Astoria for inspection. Journalists descended, eager to make sense of the ghostly discovery. Photographs from that week show the ship shrouded in fog, its deck empty but strangely pristine. The story became national news. Crew vanishes from Oregon ship, no trace of life found. The newspapers called it a maritime riddle, but to the locals it was something darker. They said the sea had taken payment, and then came the whispers. Fishermen claiming to see the Cormorant lit up at night, drifting silently along the coast, the same lantern swaying at her bow. Some said they heard shouting through the mist. Others swore they saw figures on deck, motionless, staring toward shore. Each sighting deepened the unease until the coast itself seemed haunted by her memory. When investigators finally boarded the Cormorant in daylight, what they found deepened the mystery instead of solving it. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no broken glass or bullet holes. Everything seemed to have been abandoned mid-routine, as though time itself had paused. The deck was clean, the ropes coiled neatly, and the sails, though worn, were still secured. Below, the galley remained in perfect order, a pot half filled with broth on the stove, tin plates stacked on the counter. A freshly opened bottle of whiskey sat uncorked beside two glasses, one half empty. It was clear that life aboard had continued normally right until the moment it didn't. The cargo hold was intact. Crates of mining tools and canned goods lay untouched, and nothing had been stolen. Even the ship's logbooks and maps were still in place, though the entries stopped abruptly. The ink on the final page smudged as if someone had dropped the pen mid-sentence. The crew's personal belongings, boots lined neatly beside bunks, letters home folded in jacket pockets, pipes, hats, and journals, remained where they should be. No one had packed. No one had prepared to leave. Whatever had happened, it had come suddenly, quietly and without warning. What puzzled the investigators most was the absence of any damage that could have justified abandoning ship. The Cormorant had not run aground, her hull unscarred, her rigging intact. The compass worked fine, the wheel locked in a straight position, suggesting she'd been left adrift intentionally. The lifeboat, however, was gone. That alone hinted at evacuation, but the calm weather made no sense of it. There were no signs of storm or pursuit, no record of distress, and no nearby vessels reported sighting her lifeboat. It was as if 12 men had stepped into the fog and dissolved. A search party swept the coastline for days. They found nothing. No oars, no wreckage, no bodies washed ashore. The official reports described the crew's disappearance as an abandonment under uncertain and unnatural circumstances. But those who had stepped aboard the ship refused to call it ordinary. Many of them spoke privately of an atmosphere that felt wrong, a kind of pressure in the air, as though the ship itself were holding its breath. One of the dock inspectors later told a reporter that when he entered the captain's cabin, he thought he heard footsteps behind him, heavy, deliberate, but when he turned, the door stood open and the corridor beyond was empty. He described feeling watched, though the ship was deserted. Another man swore the temperature dropped the moment he set foot below deck, his breath visible even though the day outside was mild. These reports never made it into the official investigation files. They were dismissed as nerves or imagination, but in the bars of Astoria and Tillamook, whispers spread quickly. Sailors claimed that the Cormorant had been cursed from the moment she left San Francisco. They said one of the deckhands had smuggled something aboard, a relic, a carved idol pulled from the wreck of a Polynesian schooner months before. Some swore it was still hidden somewhere in the captain's quarters. Others said the sea itself had taken offense, claiming its due in silence. Days after the discovery, one of the local fishermen who had first sighted the drifting ship began raving that he saw men walking on the water at night, just beyond the breakers, 12 of them, moving in a line, heads bowed, carrying lanterns that burned blue. His wife said he woke each night screaming, claiming to hear their voices calling from the surf. Within a week he was found drowned, his body washed up beside the pier. By then, the Cormorant had already been towed to port and sealed for inspection, but rumors of ghostly lights and muffled voices followed her. Dockhands refused to work near her at night. The harbor watchman reported seeing shadows flicker across her deck, even when the ship was locked tight. Some said they heard a single knock echo from the hull after midnight, 3 times, then silence. Nothing in the physical evidence could explain it. The ship was perfectly seaworthy. Her provisions were untouched. Her men were gone, and somewhere between the last entry in the logbook and that moment of discovery, the Cormorant had crossed from the realm of reason into something no maritime report could ever fully describe. The captain's log was the only voice left behind on the Cormorant, and it was through his final entries that investigators began piecing together the ship's last known days. The handwriting belonged to Captain Elias Ward, strong and deliberate at first, but gradually deteriorating into erratic, uneven strokes. The earliest entries were mundane, notes on cargo weight, wind direction, crew behavior. But then, as December wore on, the tone began to shift. There were mentions of restless men and unsettled seas, though weather records showed calm conditions. Ward wrote that some of the crew claimed to hear faint knocking beneath the hull at night, as if something were moving under the ship, following them north. He dismissed it at first, calling it the creaks of a weary vessel, but the tone in his writing betrayed unease. By December 17th, Ward noted that the men had begun to whisper among themselves. One, a young deckhand named Samuel Fitch, had refused to work the night shift, saying he heard voices under the planks. The captain punished him for insubordination. Yet the next entry, written the following morning, described Fitch as pale and trembling. Unfit for duty, Ward added. He claims they spoke his name. 2 days later, another sailor, Miles Granger, went missing for several hours during a heavy fog. When he returned, he was disoriented and drenched, claiming he'd followed a lantern light off the bow, thinking it belonged to a smaller vessel. But when he reached it, the light rose into the mist and vanished. The crew began to panic, insisting the sea around them had grown unnaturally quiet. The captain's notes from that evening grew terse, almost defensive. "Superstition breeds like rot," he wrote. "If I cannot restore order soon, I will lose them to fear." The next entry, dated December 20th, was the last full page ever written. The handwriting was frantic, letters pressed deep into the paper as if written in haste. Ward described waking to the sound of heavy footsteps on deck, though all men were accounted for below. When he investigated, he found no one. He mentioned hearing what he called a hollow tapping beneath the floorboards, similar to the reports the men had complained about earlier. But this time it seemed to respond to his movement, as if aware of him. Then a line written darker than the rest. "The sea is not still. Something stirs below her skin." After that, his sentences became fragmented. The ink trails off mid-thought as though interrupted. The men whisper of voices beneath the hull. "If this persists, I will investigate before dawn." And there it ended. The investigators noted faint water damage on that page, though the surrounding ones were dry. Some speculated it was seawater splashed during the ship's drift, but others whispered that the stains looked more like fingerprints, smudged and elongated, as if a wet hand had dragged across the journal. Those who examined the log described a growing sense of dread as they read through it, as though the captain himself had been spiraling into fear. Linguists who later studied the surviving copy noted that his sentence structure degraded steadily, formal maritime terminology giving way to personal, almost desperate language. It was as if discipline and logic had been consumed by something primal. Curiously, the last recorded coordinates placed the cormorant far off its intended route, drifting west into open waters rather than along the coast toward Astoria. There was no reason for the deviation, no storm to force it. The compass readings noted in the log appeared inconsistent, occasionally reversing direction without cause. Some theorized magnetic interference from the iron ore in the cargo. Others quietly suggested that Ward had begun to lose his mind. But there was one final oddity that no one could explain. Near the back of the logbook after the final entry, a single blank page bore a faint impression, writing that had been pressed too lightly to leave ink, but deeply enough to mark the paper. When held to the light, it revealed 2 words: "Below deck." No one ever discovered who wrote it or when. The handwriting was smaller, shakier, and did not match Captain Ward's own. Some believed it was one of the crew, leaving a message after the captain's last note. Others believed it was written by Ward himself, perhaps in the moments before he vanished. Whatever the truth, that final, silent imprint became the last trace of the 12 men who sailed into nothing. The first people to report seeing the cormorant before she was found adrift were the lighthouse keepers stationed along Oregon's treacherous northern coast. In late December of 1900, several keepers from Tillamook Rock Light, an isolated station perched on a sea-battered rock known grimly as Terrible Tilly, recorded strange lights on the horizon. The assistant keeper, Albert Sloan, wrote in his log that he observed a vessel's lantern swaying unnaturally, too high above the waterline to be accounted for. He watched it drift north, then vanish into the fog, only to reappear minutes later farther away. No distress signals were fired, no flares sent, just a flicker of light that refused to stay still. A few days later, fishermen operating out of Garibaldi reported hearing what they described as chanting, a low, rhythmic drone that carried over the water during the still hours before dawn. They assumed it came from a passing ship's crew, maybe men at work, until they realized the sound didn't change with the wind or distance. It seemed to echo from the fog itself. One fisherman, Peter Ellery, swore the voice called out names. When questioned by local authorities, he grew pale and refused to repeat what he'd heard, muttering only, "They weren't alive, sir. No man calls like that." On December 30th, the keepers at Tillamook Rock noted something even stranger. The sea, normally violent around the lighthouse base, had gone completely still. Sloane reported hearing a dull, repeated knocking, like a hammer striking wood carrying faintly across the water. He sent a note to the mainland by carrier line, warning that a ship may be in distress. By the time the rescue crew arrived, no vessel was visible, only a spreading patch of oil on the water, and curiously the faint smell of smoke, though nothing burned. When the cormorant was finally sighted days later, these reports resurfaced in the local newspapers. They painted a picture of a ghost ship already making its presence known before it was found. The Oregonian published a piece titled, "Lights in the Fog, Strange Apparitions Off Tillamook Head," recounting interviews with coastal residents who claimed they'd seen a bark with tattered sails moving soundlessly in the night. The descriptions were eerily consistent: 3 masts, a lantern at the bow, and the sound of metal dragging across wood. One witness claimed the vessel seemed to fade as he watched it, disappearing into the mist like breath on glass. A handful of survivors from nearby vessels later added their accounts. One captain, Jonathan Hayes, testified that he had crossed paths with the cormorant just days before she vanished. He described her as a fine ship but uneasy on the water. Her crew, he said, looked hollow-eyed like men who hadn't slept. Hayes offered to trade supplies, but Captain Ward declined, insisting they were making fine time despite the fog. Hayes recalled one odd detail. When he looked through his spyglass, he noticed movement on the deck, shadows that didn't match the crew's positions. He assumed it was a trick of light. When these testimonies reached the investigation board in Astoria, they were deemed unreliable, too superstitious, too influenced by rumor. But for the people who lived along that stretch of coast, the stories were not so easily dismissed. Many had lost family to the sea, and they knew its moods intimately. The fog that winter was different, they said, thicker, heavier, as if alive. Dogs refused to go near the shoreline. Fishermen began avoiding night voyages entirely. There were also reports that in the weeks following the cormorant's discovery, the lighthouse keepers continued to see her light. Sloane recorded one final note in his journal. "The bark has returned. No crew visible. Lantern swaying in perfect rhythm with the tide." When authorities investigated the claim, they found no ship in sight. The sea was empty, the air silent. But in the keeper's logbook pressed into the margin beside his entry, someone, likely Sloane himself, had drawn a small mark. 12 dots in a line, each connected by a single wavering stroke. As the official investigation faltered, theories began to take root among sailors, investigators, and townsfolk alike, each trying to make sense of how 12 men could vanish from a perfectly sound vessel. The most practical minds blamed mutiny. They claimed the crew, tired of Captain Ward's strict hand and long hours, had turned against him. Perhaps tempers flared, a fight broke out, and someone was killed. Out of panic or guilt, the others might have fled in the lifeboat, leaving the ship to drift. It was a story the newspapers loved, but one that quickly began to unravel. If there had been violence, why no blood? Why were the captain's pistol and saber still locked in his desk? And if they had fled, where were they now? The sea was calm that week. The lifeboat would have reached shore easily, yet not a single man appeared in any nearby port, nor did any body wash ashore. It was as if the mutiny, if it ever occurred, had taken place in another world. A second theory emerged among locals: madness at sea, a creeping delirium brought on by isolation, damp air, and silence. Some whispered that the ship had carried a cursed cargo, maybe mercury or arsenic, and the fumes had poisoned the men slowly, driving them to paranoia and hallucination. The image of 12 sailors descending one by one into madness gripped the public imagination. One maritime doctor speculated that the cormorant's lower decks might have collected gas from her lantern oil, causing hallucinations before suffocation. Yet even that couldn't explain why the deck and cabins were left so orderly, or why one lantern was still burning when the ship was found. No man in delirium trims a wick before abandoning his life. And then came the superstitions, the kind of stories that thrive where the ocean meets fear. Some believed the cormorant had crossed a place known among old sailors as the sea's mouth, an invisible rift where the living could slip into the realm of the drowned. According to the myth, those who heard voices beneath their hull were being called home by the dead, the tapping described in the captain's log, the whispers reported by crewmen. It all fit too neatly for the superstitious to ignore. One theory, though rarely spoken above a whisper, centered on the relic said to have been smuggled aboard, an artifact carved from dark wood, found drifting in a crate from a wrecked Polynesian schooner weeks before the Cormorant sailed. The story went that a crewman had stolen it, believing it to be valuable, and hidden it among the cargo. Fishermen along the Oregon coast, steeped in old sea lore, claimed that such relics were often anchors for spirits, objects that bound the drowned to the living world. Some said the idol's presence had cursed the ship, that the whispers from the hull were its call. But the strangest accounts came from those who boarded the vessel after her discovery. Several men reported feeling nauseous and dizzy when below deck, as if the air were thick or humming. One dock worker swore he saw a man standing at the end of the corridor near the captain's quarters, a man in uniform. But when he stepped closer, the space was empty. The same worker refused to go near the ship again, saying, "It doesn't want us here." Even the officials couldn't agree. The Maritime Board concluded the disappearance resulted from human dereliction of duty under psychological duress, a hollow phrase that explained nothing. The investigators closed the case, but the rumors refused to die. Sailors passing the coast began to treat the Cormorant as a curse, spitting overboard when they spoke her name. Mothers told their children never to follow strange lights in the fog, and still, some swore they heard the tapping. Years later, long after the ship was gone, fishermen reported faint knocks echoing through their hulls when they sailed past Tillamook Head. 3 taps, then silence. Those who heard it would always look down at the dark water and wonder whether the Cormorant's lost crew was still out there, waiting just beneath the surface. After the Cormorant was towed into Astoria and inspected, the authorities decided the ship would be stripped and sold for salvage. Yet those who worked on her claimed the vessel resisted them, almost as if alive. Men complained of headaches and nausea while aboard. Tools went missing, ropes came undone, and more than one worker claimed to hear faint movement below deck, like footsteps pacing in an empty hold. The dock supervisor dismissed it as paranoia, but 2 men quit the job altogether, refusing to return even for double pay. The locals began to call the ship the Dead Man's Bark, and by the end of the month even the harbor master refused to let her remain moored overnight. The first real tragedy came soon after. A young shipwright named Henry Lorne, who had been tasked with removing the remaining cargo, vanished one night while working alone below deck. His lantern was later found near the captain's quarters, its glass cracked, its flame long extinguished. The next morning his boots were discovered at the water's edge, lined neatly side by side. The water was calm and there was no sign of a struggle. The incident shook the town. Some whispered that the sea had come to claim another man, finishing what it had started. After that, no one dared to go near the Cormorant. She sat at the dock like a monument to dread, rocking gently in the tide. On clear nights, her reflection on the water appeared too sharp, too distinct, as though it belonged to another ship beneath the surface. The town council, fearing both public hysteria and financial loss, ordered her to be burned and sunk offshore. A tugboat dragged her several miles out to sea, and men doused her decks in kerosene. Witnesses from the coast later said the flames seemed to burn unnaturally slow, as though the fire itself resisted consuming her. When she finally sank, the ocean glowed faintly red beneath the waves before swallowing her whole. For a while, the town exhaled. People began to move on, though fishermen still muttered old prayers when they passed Tillamook Head. But 12 years later, in the autumn of 1913, a report surfaced that reignited the fear. A small fishing trawler out of Newport claimed to have nearly collided with a derelict ship in heavy fog. The description was unmistakable: 3 masts, blackened wood, and a single lantern glowing at the bow. When the fishermen approached, they saw no crew, only a faint light flickering in the captain's cabin. One of the men swore he could make out a figure standing by the window, staring out to sea. They turned back immediately. When they returned with others the next morning, the ocean was empty. Over the next few decades, the sightings multiplied. Ships reported glimpsing a drifting silhouette along the Oregon coast during periods of dense fog, always silent, always unlit save for a lone lantern. Sailors began to speak of her as if she were a living legend. Some said she appeared before storms as a warning. Others believed she was still searching for her lost crew. Old men in the harbors of Astoria told young deckhands never to call out to strange ships in the mist. for fear that the cormorant might answer. By the 1940s, even the Coast Guard logged 2 unexplained radar echoes near Tillamook Head, both matching the shape and size of a 19th-century bark. No vessel was visible when they went to investigate. When divers were later sent down to examine the seabed, they found no wreck, only fragments of scorched timber scattered far deeper than a wooden ship should have sunk. Decades passed, but the legend persisted. Each generation added its own details: ghostly lights, voices calling from the waves, phantom knocks against hulls. Some claim to have seen faces in the water, pale and expressionless, drifting just below the surface. For the towns along the coast, the cormorant became less a story and more a warning, a reminder of what the sea could take without reason. And still, sometimes on nights when the fog swallows the shore, fishermen say they glimpse a faint light far out at sea, bobbing steadily as if carried by an unseen hand. For years after the final sighting of the cormorant, Astoria lived in uneasy peace. The fishermen still muttered her name in hushed tones, especially when fog rolled in thick and heavy from the Pacific. Many of the older townsfolk claimed they could still hear her creaking timbers on windless nights, as though she were adrift just beyond the horizon. It became a kind of superstition, an inherited fear that passed from father to son, mother to daughter. The younger generation laughed at the stories, calling them ghost tales for sailors. But every few years, something happened that made even the skeptics go quiet again. One such moment came in 1954, when a group of divers exploring the coast for shipwrecks discovered a series of massive iron nails buried deep in the silt, 30 miles south of where the cormorant had supposedly gone down. The metal was warped by fire, and one diver, an ex-Navy man named Walter Keene, claimed that when he touched the fragments, his regulator filled with the faint scent of kerosene and smoke. When they brought the nails to the surface, the air around them reportedly shimmered with a faint heat, even though the water temperature had been freezing. The find was quickly dismissed by authorities as belonging to another wreck, but those who handled the fragments swore they came from her. In the years that followed, the cormorant became a local obsession again. A radio host in Portland dedicated an entire broadcast to the Phantom of Tillamook Head, retelling the story with embellished drama and sound effects. Callers phoned in claiming their fathers or uncles had seen the ship in the 1920s, or that they'd heard strange bells echoing from the sea at night. One fisherman even claimed to have hauled up an old brass compass from his nets that still pointed west, no matter where he stood. He sold it to a museum in Astoria, where it was displayed in a small glass case labeled simply, "Recovered Artifact, Origin Unknown." By 1971, the mystery took a darker turn. A coastal storm tore through Oregon that winter, the worst in decades. Entire sections of the wharf were destroyed, and several small boats vanished at sea. In the aftermath, when the debris washed ashore, townsfolk found something chilling among the wreckage: a section of charred wood engraved faintly with the letters "More." Experts later identified the carving as part of the cormorant's original nameplate. The find reignited old fears. Local papers ran headlines calling it "the ship that wouldn't die." That night, witnesses along the northern cliffs reported seeing a light moving through the mist far out to sea. Some said it flickered like a lantern. Others swore they saw the faint outline of masts swaying in the fog. Even into the 1990s, long after most had forgotten the legend, there were still accounts. Fishermen who came back shaken, claiming to have crossed paths with a silent ship that vanished when they approached. The Coast Guard received enough reports that one officer, Lieutenant Sarah Langdon, launched an unofficial investigation. Reviewing decades of sightings, she noticed a strange pattern. Every report, from 1901 to 1996, had occurred in October within a narrow 20-mile radius off Tillamook Head. Langdon later told a journalist that she'd found something else too. Each report coincided with a night when the barometric pressure dropped unusually low just before a storm. "It's almost," she said, "like the sea exhales before she appears." After that interview, Langdon disappeared from public record. Her transfer papers were filed to another station, but no one ever confirmed where she went. Some of her notes, however, were later discovered in a storage facility near the docks, pages filled with tide charts, wind maps, and one recurring phrase scrawled in red ink: "She returns when the air stands still." In recent years, Satellite images have occasionally picked up unexplained shapes moving along the same coastal stretch, though each one vanishes within minutes. To most, the cormorant remains nothing more than a maritime ghost story, a tale sailors tell over whiskey when the night runs too long. But for those who live by the Oregon shore, the legend endures like the tide, always there, always waiting, and never entirely gone. Some even claim that on certain nights in October, when the fog rolls thick across the water, the air grows oddly warm and still, and a faint, rhythmic creaking echoes from the unseen horizon, as though a long-buried ship were passing once more through the mist. If the sea could speak, what would it say about the cormorant, a ship that vanished into fog yet refuses to rest beneath it? Perhaps it's not the vessel that haunts the water, but the memory of those who never made it home. Tell me, do you believe something can truly disappear? Or does every soul, every secret leave an echo behind? If stories like this stir something in you, if you feel the chill of history's forgotten corners, then join us, subscribe, step deeper into the dark, and help us uncover more truths buried beneath time. And before you go, leave your thoughts below. What do you think became of the cormorant and her crew? Because sometimes the only thing separating legend from truth is one voice daring to remember.